McCune. A little about myself. Like I said, this is my 31st year in beekeeping. Got my first hives in 1989. Thought about it about 5 years before that, but it took me a while to get kids through school and college and married and all that good stuff. So I hope from my talk today you'll realize what a sophisticated insect the honeybee is. It actually works as one living organism. There can be upwards of 100,000 bees in that hive. They all have very specific jobs that they do on a timeline throughout their life. And everyone's dependent on everyone else to do their job. I started doing these talks about 4 or 5 years ago when people started realizing there was something going wrong with the bees. Almost kind of like the canary in the coal mine. And so I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to break this down into about 3 parts. First of all, the players in a beehive, some of the products of a beehive, and then tell you a little bit about what we do. So here we go. Of course, everybody knows the queen. The queen bee. I'm always asked, is she that much bigger than the other bees? She's not. Her abdomen is just a little bit longer. So what's her job in the hive? Her job is to lay eggs, and that's what she does. And now that the weather's starting to warm up, she will start laying anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000 eggs a day. She will take a hive in the spring. Most of my hives right now are somewhere between 12 and 13,000 bees. And by August, that population can be up to 75, 80,000 bees. When you think about it, that's quite amazing because the honeybee only lives 6 weeks long in its working life in the summer. The only bees that live longer are the bees that are born in September, October, and the bees that will get them through the winter. So that's her job. You can see all the nurse bees around her. They feed her, they clean her, they remove her waste. All she does is go from cell to cell and lay an egg. Now she's got a pretty good life until as she starts to age and she starts to slow down that egg production. Those same nurse bees that are taking care of her are the same bees that will drag her out of the colony and kill her. Because once they feel she cannot keep that population enough for foragers to get food to get through the winter, it's a survival mode. And so once she slows down, she's replaced. How does she get replaced? They'll kill her, and then they'll take an egg that she laid, and they'll turn that into a queen bee. The only difference between the queen and her daughter bees is what she's fed in the larva stage. They feed her a little bit better and a little bit longer, and that's the difference between the queen and the sister bees. Those are all female worker bees. This is the drone. This is the bee that I teach my grandkids not to be afraid, because the drone looks like a honeybee, but he's the only one in the colony that doesn't have a stinger. He does not sting. You'll notice those big eyes he has. Now, like the queen, the drone has one function in that hive, and that's to go out with all his buddies and swim in a big circle up in the air and wait for a virgin queen to be lucky enough to fly through that big swarm and mate with the drones. And if a drone is lucky, of the hundreds of thousands of drones flying in that area, if he's lucky enough to hook up with that queen, he dies instantly after that famous act, and he falls to the ground and dies. It's a terrible death, but that's what he does. They don't work, they don't bring in food, they don't clean. The drone's got a pretty good life until after about the first couple hard frosts in the fall. They're all marched out of the hive, not allowed to be let back in, and they all freeze to death. So no male bees make it through the winter. So you're asking yourself, well, if there's no male bees that make it through the winter, how do we get a male bee in the spring, right? Yeah. The queen, when she goes out, she takes a mating flight after she's born. First, she kills any competition, because when they sense that they're queenless, they will lay about 4 or 5 queen cells, or up to 10. And they look like peanut cells. You can see them in the hive. And the first queen to emerge from that, excuse me, she'll instinctively goes to those other queen cells, opens them up, and stings her competition to death. And then she'll take a mating flight. And she will mate upwards of 17 to 35 times to keep the gene pool intact. And what she can do when she gets back to that hive, she can lay a fertilized or an unfertilized egg at her will. And in the spring, she realizes there has to be drones, so she will start laying unfertilized eggs, and that will produce the males, and fertilized eggs will produce the female bees. So she has that ability within her body. The worker bees, these are the girls. They do all the work. You know, the male bee, my wife kind of says, it's kind of like NFL Sunday when the guys are all sitting in the living room watching the football game. The women are all out making the food and cooking everything. These guys do nothing. They just lay around. It's like I said, it's a great life for them until fall. So here's the sister bees, the worker bees. They are what makes it happen. They have very sophisticated things that they do at very certain times, thank you so much, in their life to make that hive work. When they're first born, they become nurse bees, and they feed their little sister bees that they probably will never live to see food to get them through the larva stage and into a regular bee. Then they become house bees. Bees are extremely clean. The inside of a hive is very clean, pristine. Any dead bees or anything that doesn't belong in that hive, they're removing, always working. Their next job is they become guard bees. People will ask me, especially at Notre Dame Cathedral Latin, they'll say, how can you have 30 hives all lined up, all painted white? How do the bees know which hive to go into? That queen gives off a pheromone, a scent, if you will. And those nurse bees that are taking care of her, they're passing that scent to every bee in that colony. So any bee that lands on that landing board to go into that hive needs to have the scent of that queen, or they're not allowed in. Okay, so now we're going to talk about products of the hive. We know who the players are. Now, what do they do? What do they make? Of course, honey. Now, I've given talks to senior citizens, I've given talks to kindergartners, fifth graders, and I can tell you I've heard a lot of definitions of what honey is. And it's neither one of those. Honey is not bee poop. Honey is not bee puke. The honeybee has a digestive system much like yours, except she has a separate honey stomach. So when they're out there flying and taking that nectar off that plant, it's coming in and she'll come back like in this last picture, and she's transferring that to another sister bee who will transfer it to another sister bee, and they will put it in a cell, beat their wings over it to bring out the moisture, and then cap it with wax. They actually have 8 little wax secretion glands under their stomach, and they will preserve that because honeybees, of the thousands of different kinds of wasps, hornets, and bees, are the only bees that live all winter long. So they need a food source. Your bullface hornets and all those other insects that live in the ground, they all die off after the couple hard frosts in the winter, except the queens who will burrow into the ground or in the bark of a tree, and they come out in the spring and start from scratch all over. No help, all by themselves, whereas honeybees usually make it all winter long. So they need a food source to help them do that. So honey. I always tell people if you're going to buy honey, honey is still known as a pure natural food. Someone asked me, why do you have on your label raw and unfiltered? I don't heat or filter my honey at all. I produced almost 5 tons of honey last year, and I don't heat it or filter it because everything that's supposed to be good and natural about honey, I still want in it. And I hate to beat up grocery stores because I shop at grocery stores. But the honey you see in the grocery stores, 2 things. If it is honey, it's been heated and filtered about 37 different times. And the reason that is grocery store people do not want to see crystallized honey on the shelf. Because there's still a perception with some people, well, it went bad. It got hard, it went bad, I throw it out. Honey never, ever spoils, ever. They have found honey in the tombs of the Egyptians that's still edible. Now I'm going to tell you, I've seen that honey, I would not eat it. But that's what they say. But honey has bacterial products in it that just doesn't allow germs and whatever to multiply, so it never goes bad. Honey was actually used for wounds and cuts in pre-times than it was for a food source. During the Civil War, when they were hacking people's arms and legs off, they packed them in honey because bacteria cannot live in honey. So anyway, that's why I don't heat or filter my honey. The other thing is, I read a report not too long ago that 75% of the honey on grocery store shelves isn't even honey. It's rice syrup coming from China. And that's a shame that there are unscrupulous people. You know, I don't understand this about the Chinese. We banned them from shipping a lot of honey here because they're just doing some nasty things to it. And so their barrels coming from China were all blue. And so what they did, they started spray painting them green and hoping that the customs wouldn't see them. And then they started doing things like, here's an example. We buy about 140 million pounds of tons of honey from Vietnam. Vietnam has 5 beehives. So you tell me where that honey's coming from, okay? Well, that's another story. But that's honey, and that's a food source. The honeybee, unless you can tell me different, is the only insect in the world that produces a food source. Unless you're eating chocolate-covered grasshoppers, I don't think there's another insect that produces a food source as pure and natural as honey. Pollen. Bees are a lot like humans. They need 2 things to survive. They need protein and they need carbohydrates, just like you. The pollen is the protein, the honey is the carbohydrates. I sell almost as much pollen as I do honey. Sell it to a lot of health food stores. My daughter, until last week, she just sold it, but she had a health food store in Chagrin called Cultivate. And they put it in their smoothies, they sprinkle it on their salad, they put it in their yogurt, they stick it on top of their oatmeal. It's a high protein energy food. I had a woman call me one time and she said, "Do you sell bee pollen?" And at that time, in 1989, I had 2 beehives. I said, "Yes, I sell pollen." She says, "I need 25 50-pound bags." And I thought to myself, what are you doing with that much pollen? Well, the horse that won the Kentucky Derby that year was on a bee pollen diet. They mix it into the food. And she had horses at Northfield Track, and that's why she was buying it. Of course, I couldn't do that kind of amount. Today I couldn't do that kind of amount, but there are people who can. So pollen is, and I tell people, I have a lot of people who take that, but if you've never taken bee pollen and you're thinking about it, start at a very, very small amount, like 1/8 of a teaspoon, and make sure you don't have a reaction, because some people do have a reaction to it. Not many, but some. So you need to be very careful or check with your doctor first.
Are those soft or hard?
They're soft. They're soft. Those are little pellets that come right off the flower that the bees bring back.
What do they taste like?
It tastes terrible. It doesn't taste like honey. To me, it tastes terrible. Now, I have people that take it by the tablespoons and they just love it. My mailman just takes a spoon. He loves it. I personally don't. But I guess it's a matter of taste. But it does not have a honey taste.
What kind of reaction do you can get?
You can't breathe. You have a reaction to your esophagus. Okay, candles. 100% beeswax candle, I have some up here, will burn 3 times longer than a paraffin candle. Remember, a paraffin candle is an oil-based product. Usually when you light a paraffin candle, you see that puff of black smoke. That's oil. I used to know a gentleman in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He had 15,000 hives, and honey to him was just an inconvenience. All he wanted was the wax, because at that time he sold all his wax to the Catholic churches for bees. All the candles in a Catholic church at one time were all 100% beeswax candles. That has now been taken over by the AI Root Company in Medina. And if you ever get a chance to tour that, it is something to see. But that's all he wanted for wax. And what he didn't sell to the Catholic Church, he sold to France. Anybody know why? Wow. Because the foundation for all ladies' cosmetics starts with 100% beeswax. Mind your own beeswax. That's right. They say that pure natural beeswax candles also put positive ions into the atmosphere, which is good for us. And so we sell a lot of candles during the holidays. And so the number one thing that bees do is pollination. Okay? They have little baskets on the back of their leg where they'll stuff that in there, and then they fly back to the hive and they scrape it off into the cells, and they actually wet it a little with their saliva, and it's called bee bread, and that's part of the food that they'll feed to the new young bees that are being born. Okay, so the main topic of what we're here to talk about. What's happening with the bees? About 30 years ago, people started noticing bees were dying at an alarming rate. And I can tell you, it hasn't gotten much better today as I speak. Number one problem, queens. This is the queen bee. There are beekeepers throughout the country that do nothing but make queens to sell to other beekeepers. They're usually in the South or in California. And all they do, they make hundreds of thousands of queens. And then they sell them to beekeepers like myself or commercial beekeepers. Speaking of that, I had a meeting with the Department of Agriculture the other day, and I found out, I always considered myself a sideline beekeeper, small beekeeper. But their definition is if you sell 1 jar of honey, you are a commercial beekeeper. So as today, I am a commercial beekeeper. Anyway, queens. When I first started beekeeping in 1989, you could buy a queen from California or Georgia for $5. Now they're $40. And they've become very expensive. And what's happened, because of this problem that we're having and with the die-off that we're having over winter, the people who do nothing but raise queens are having a problem keeping up. In the old days, that queen that they made would come back to a little nuke box, and they would wait a month or two to see what kind of laying pattern and eggs that she had. Was she a good layer? Was she doing a lot of eggs? Did she breed enough with the other drones that she had a good supply, that she could lay that many eggs for a long period of time? And once they were sure that she was a good quality queen, they put her in a little queen cage with some attendant bees to take care of her, and off she went to whoever was buying her. Well, what's happened is that now, because there's such a rush and people want queens, these guys, as soon as that queen comes back from mating, they're putting her in a cage and she's going off, and you don't know if she's good or not. I spend $40 for that queen. I put her in my hive, and I don't know if she's any good or not now until she starts laying. And the bad part is, if she is no good, the nurse bees taking care of her will sense it before I do, and they will drag her out and kill her, and there goes my $40 out the window. And that's a problem that we are having right now in the beekeeping world. I didn't tell you, I graduated from Kenston High School in 1971. If you do the math, that makes me 46, 47, somewhere in there. But I went to college on a full scholarship for wrestling. And I used to have to lose a lot of weight. So I ran every dirt road in Auburn Township in Geauga County most of my high school life. And this is what it looked like. This is what it looks like today. You see any bee food in that picture. So the meadows and the fields and everything that we had that supplied a lot of food for bees is gone. And that's not just happening in Auburn Township, that's happening all over the world. So one of the big problems besides faulty queens is there's not enough food for bees anymore. If you tell a beekeeper, if I could talk to a gentleman or a lady that was a beekeeper 50 years ago, and I told them that I have to feed my bees at certain times because there's not enough food, they look at me like I was crazy. But the honey flow here in Northeast Ohio starts June 1st and it ends July 15th. And from July 15th to about the middle of August till the goldenrod blooms, I have to feed my bees so they don't starve to death. This is a farm, a modern farm. To be on a modern farm today, I might as well be on a golf course. And as you know, golf courses use more pesticides, fertilizers, and anything you can think of to keep that golf course pristine. How many watched the Masters this weekend? Yeah. Do you know that the sounds of the birds and stuff that you hear on TV when they do that are pumped in? Yeah, they're not real. Okay? And that's because there's probably not a living creature near that golf course. And it's the same with all golf courses. There's very few living things you see on a golf course. Well, unfortunately, the same thing is happening on modern farms. In the old days, if you asked a beekeeper from 50 years ago, he'd love to get on a farm. Today, I try to stay as far away from a farm as I can. And the problem with that is some of the new chemicals that farmers are using today, they're called neonics or neonicotinoids. And what that means is the pesticide, insecticide, is incorporated right into the seed that they're planting. If you've ever watched a farmer plant corn, they use talc in the machine to make sure that the corn rolls out of that machine into the ground faster. And what happens, all that poison insecticide that's in the seed, surrounding the seed, dust blows it when it's blowing. It goes into the ditches, it goes into the streams. And so now when my bees were working weeds that were on the side of the road, it's poison. And so when that little bee leaves that hive, and she's flying out to find food, to take back to a sister bee that she'll never be around to see, she's taking back poison. The bees are actually living in a toxic hell right now in these hives. They've done studies on some of the wax, and there's even in Pennsylvania, they did a study on some beehives and the wax. They were finding still traces of DDT. DDT was outlawed over 50 years ago. Some of that stuff does not break down. But these neonicotinoids is a new way of kind of hurting beekeepers, because in the old days a farmer would tell me, hey, I'm spraying. You got to cover your bees or get them out of there. Well, now he don't have to tell me that, because he don't have to spray, because everything he needs is right in that seed. So when that flower blooms, it's poisonous. So the biggest problem that beekeepers are having. I told you I started beekeeping in 1989. In 1987, ship from Florida, this little bugger right here landed. It's called a Varroa mite. Its proper name is Varroa Destructor, and boy did it destruct. For the next 30 years, it has decimated commercial beekeeping. The average loss for beekeepers right now is somewhere between 35 and 50%. I've heard in some states 75%. Now imagine if you're a commercial beekeeper. The largest beekeeper in the United States is named Richard Adey. He's in about 5 states and he has 75,000 hives. In 96, 97, he lost 50% of his bees. That puts you out of business. It's not sustainable. Think about it. If you had 5 kids and one died every year, pretty soon you got no more kids. And that's what's happening in beekeeping. If the beef industry, the chicken industry, every other industry, if they were having the same problems that the beekeepers are having, this country would be up in arms about what's happening in the food supply. But what they tell beekeepers is, well, you can take a frame of eggs from bees, put it in another hive, it'll make a new queen, you'll have another hive, and that's all true. But what it costs me to do that hive won't be productive for another year or better. So I've got all the workforce, everything I need to keep it alive, all invested, and so it's just kind of going to the wayside. we first thought they were sucking the blood out of the bee's body. What happens is this is a female mite. And so when that queen lays that egg, that female mite crawls in that cell. And then when the bees cap it over with wax, she will lay 2 female daughters and a male in that cell. And then that male will mate with his 2 sisters and his mother. And that scenario happens over and over. So when that honeybee emerges from that cell, there may be 20, 30 mites crawling out with her. So where one crawled in, 20 or 30 are crawling out. And what's happening is, as the weather starts to decrease, or it starts to get colder in the fall, the queen cuts back her egg laying. So the population of the bees is going like this, the population of the mites is going like this, and when you hit that arrow right there, I remember when this first happened, I had some beautiful hives in the fall, loaded, packed with honey for the winter, looked beautiful, well populated. They were all dead by March. I remember in 1993, the mites hadn't worked its way up to Ohio yet, and we were hearing these horror stories in Florida how beekeepers were just being decimated by this mite. And I looked at my hives. I had over 100 hives at that time, and I thought, I'm doing pretty good. I must be right up there with beekeepers because I got this down. And I came out of that winter with 2 hives out of 100. Now, had I been smart then, I would have sold the equipment, bought a set of golf clubs, and who knows, I might have won the Masters. But, yeah. But this is the guy that has put everybody on edge. And beekeepers are very sensitive about using chemicals in your hive because honey is still known as a product that's pure and natural. So if you start adding chemicals to your hive, you don't know if it's getting in the honey or whatever. So we try to do things that are integrated pest management. I do certain things. I'll change queens mid-year, or we have these green frames that have drone brood cells in the foundation. So when it's drawn out, the queen will just lay drone cone eggs in there, and when that's full, I'll take it out because the female mites love the drone comb better than the other ones because they're bigger. And I'll take it out, I'll shake the V's off, and I put it in the freezer, and I put an empty one in there, and I keep switching, like every 6 weeks I switch them. So it doesn't kill all the mites, but it knocks them down to a level that should be manageable. So far we have found nothing. And we were told at a state meeting not too long ago, there's another mite on its way from Asia that makes this one look like nothing. So it doesn't look good for all of us. So there's a couple things I want you to remember from my talk today, the important things. This is a picture of Whole Foods in their produce department. This is what it looks like without pollination. If it wasn't for honeybees, you'd be eating gruel. I said that to my grandkids and they go, Grandpa, what's gruel? Yeah, it's like what's coal in your stocking. Remember that? What's that? Yeah. Well, honeybees produce 1/3 of everything you eat. Things that you don't even think of. The biggest pollination event in the country happened in February and early March in California in the almond groves. The almond groves are the size, a little bigger than the size of the state of Rhode Island. There's 500,000 beehives already in California. They bring in another 600,000 hives from across the country just to pollinate the almonds. We had a guy from California one time, blonde hair, he had sandals on in the winter, and he's giving us a talk and he kept saying almonds. I'm going, what the heck is he talking about, almonds? He said, did you ever see how they harvest almonds? I said, no. He said, they got a tractor with a big thing on it like this, and it clamps around the trunk of the bee or the tree, and they actually shake the L out of it. Shake the L out of it. Almonds. So, and then after those hives leave the almond groves, They go up to Oregon and Washington, do the apples. They'll head over to Wisconsin and do the cranberries. I know a gentleman in Florida that had about 12,000 to 15,000 hives. All he did was pollinate up and down the East Coast. He would do the orange groves in Florida, the peaches in Georgia. He'd go up to Maine and New Hampshire and do the wild short blueberries. And that's all he did, back and forth, back and forth. I tell children, even that burger you ate at McDonald's is attributed to the pollination of the honeybee, because the grain that the cow ate that gave its life for that burger was pollinated by honeybees. Things you don't even think of, carrot seeds, celery seeds, are pollinated by honeybees, 1/3 of everything you eat. People say, well, there's other pollinators besides honeybees. Bats pollinate, butterflies pollinate. I said, you're absolutely right. But you can't put 600 boxes of bats on a truck and take them from Ohio to California to pollinate almonds. So that's pretty much the end of my presentation. And this is something I hope I did today. Speak in such a way that others love to listen to you. Listen in such a way that others love to speak to you. Thank you.